Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Disc Guidance segment with the 2MK team. Today we are looking at our Zangief and Rashid bots as soon as I've got confirmation that the sound is coming through okay, and which I've just got, so time to show them off. If you're not familiar with the general way that these streams go, first I'll be discussing why the bot is built the way it is, along with some information on whether or not the CPU is useful to you, and a general overview of how the point system works. Then we'll go into some possibly demonstration of CPU things. In Zangief's case, this is likely to happen a little earlier than usual into the stream actually, and then go into the precise inputs you need, any variations those have, and the exact point systems and extra information. So, onward. If you're familiar with these games enough, you'll know that there's a specific thing that happens when you set the CPU to a high enough level in the game. Most people will call it input reading. The game reads your inputs and therefore causes you problems in that it just knows what to do against anything you could do. Once this happens, it basically means that you can't do anything to it under certain circumstances. And once you can't do that, then... see what I've got? There we go. You also can't necessarily learn how to fight actual players, because while players can certainly be very fast and come up with very strong ideas, even if they had perfect reactions, it would not necessarily bring them to that level. The problem with the Zangief bot is that it's actually kind of difficult to tell the difference between it and the CPU other than the input reading. But the input reading is enough of a big deal that we eventually realized and decided, no, we're not going to just leave this like that. Previously, we were basically not building bots for certain characters because we were thinking that it would be sufficient for you to use the CPU and learn to match up that way, or at least get the basic information required to fight them. Zangief is very much not that. But fortunately, in terms of understanding what you want the bot to do, or what you even want the CPU to do in terms of you learning to fight the character, it's not as bad. Zangief has relatively simplistic game plans for any given character. And our goal therefore in bot design would be to make it so that everything you could possibly do with your own character somehow triggers the Zangief bot to have the appropriate reaction. This is going to come up later because this is one of those bots where you do have to actually know or come up with some of the variations yourself. So, let me briefly show off that part. They've changed the input reader again, haven't they? Alright then. We're just going to switch the computer to CPU level 6. We're going to go straight there rather than trying to show off the level 4 one. Right now this looks pretty normal. But after a little bit, he'll start to grab from way too far away at places where most players won't have the sense or guts to go for it. And the things he can therefore react to get to be a little bit complicated. Now, while it's not necessarily easy to beat Zangief in neutral, he does have a few weaknesses in terms of where his longer normals end up putting him. But there you go, there's our first demonstration of that. At a certain range, on Chun-Li I actually can't use stand heavy punch because he will react to the stand heavy punch with his command grab. And this gets even more complicated as you go into things like drive impact. While you generally shouldn't just use drive impact whenever you want in this game, it should probably be at least somewhat a thing you can generally do when deciding if you want to pressure your opponent further. Zangief basically doesn't allow for this to work. If he's able to stop you and hasn't already pressed an attack, he will basically command grab you out of it every time. Which means that you're either definitely succeeding all the time, or failing not necessarily because a player would be able to stop you, literally able to stop you, but simply that the CPU is too good and too quick at it. In fact, depending on what's necessary, if you were to watch the side, you can see Zangief's input for his spinning pile driver to be something that you generally wouldn't expect to be easily possible for a player, far less anything else. Generally, he does this by walking forward, and once he is walked forward enough, because he doesn't actually need to change from this part, he does a quarter circle back, then up, where all of those inputs are exactly one frame, and then punches. This basically means that he is not only able to do spinning pile driver from walking forward at you, he's able to do it in functionally 5 frames, as in the execution of it is 5 frames for effort for him. You can see it there on the side of the screen now. 1 frame forward, and then back. This means that every flinch you have in this matchup of any kind is basically just reactable by this 4-frame instant destruction. And this isn't necessarily that helpful. So, we had to go come up with a bot that can do similar things. But working with the CPU for a while did give us some good insights on how to improve the bot input for this character, which is usually relatively difficult because of his requirements. If the input reader is willing to accept just quarter, circle, back, then up and punches, and not fail the spinning pile driver, it means we can use a lot of our edge shifting techniques and put the inputs together in such a way that this ends up happening, and more importantly can be controlled to happen at good timings instead of before for our Street Fighter 5 bot where we needed to try to input the entire spinning pile driver and somehow get it to come out at only the times we wanted it to. Unfortunately, that didn't quite work out. He still does the move at times where you might not think there was any benefit to it, but he also has a much higher incidence of using it when necessary. It depends also on the specific variation aspects of the input. And then moves on from there. Okay, let's turn that on now. Or not. So, now we move into the part of the stream where I'm explaining why the bot is built the way it is, beyond what I've already said. The main things you need to understand about Zangief are very, very dependent on your own character. Some characters need to get into his face and try to hit him all the time, so that he can't really do as much. These are the ones who mostly suffer from that sort of thing. But note that we are no longer on the CPU. This is the bot. It just happens to have that grab at that timing. You also care about whether or not your character specifically tries to go into the air a lot, because it determines which supers you want him to have. And if you try to play footsies with him at certain ranges, you want him to use his sweep or similar attacks, and if you don't, then it's just wasted space. He'll just whiff it and make himself even more punishable. The amount of parry he has isn't really important, so you'll have some leniency in how you make some of these inputs later on. And because I didn't actually know how many ways he'd be affected, I made sure to input this specific bot across all 4 of the accounts that I usually use for testing, so I'm pretty confident in which things work in which ways now. These will be detailed more on our website, to-nk.org, with the release of the bot, but the part that you care about as the user now is that you have a lot of flexibility at one specific point, which I'll explain when we get there. So pay attention to Action 7 when I reach that point of input demonstrations, because it's going to be much more important than basically any other input. More so because it's under your control and your choices. And because you have to really think through the rest of the inputs, at least a bit, to understand what can be changed easily and what can't. So now, onward to explaining the inputs themselves. Let's turn this off to avoid confusions, and then start replaying. This input is fairly simple. You can see the entirety of it between the neutral inputs on the right side. It starts with a forward medium kick. It does not need to be first frame. If you're not familiar with that concept, we'll come up with it later. But it does need to be relatively long at the beginning. Note that the forward medium kick is held for 17 frames. The forward itself, it has to be held for a fairly long time. I've tested this anywhere in a range from 16 to like 28, so you don't have to worry too much about how precise you are at this point. If your character defends a lot and you spend a lot of time blocking, you probably care more about it being longer. Since this is on the account of our Cammy player, we don't care about that. This one is customized to her uses, and therefore the amount of time he spends on that can be a lot shorter. From there, while holding the medium kick the entire time, just continue to do a half circle back and end the recording quickly. This goes back to what we were mentioning before. This gives him some amount of time where he's been holding forward, and then in this case, half circle back, not even just a quarter circle. If it's quick enough, it means that the next input, which is just starting with up and 2 punches, should have the capacity to do his spinning pile driver in combination with Action 1. That also kind of needs to be the first frame that is the input, but it's one of those inputs where it's not really worth your time to go through an entire specific setup to get the first frame done. Just try it a few times until you get it to work. After that, another half circle back, which technically means that if this is done correctly and repeat replay is used, he can just do that move by itself. And that gives him 2 opportunities where he's probably not doing much of anything else and can therefore grab you. If he's not moving, then you're in danger, which is good to have for Zangief bot. This one being 28 frames in total, as I said, can be quite a bit longer. The 28 I was referring to was how long you can actually hold that forward. Because you held the button the entire time from action 1, he won't actually do any moves. He'll just do the hopping knee once and then wiggle forward, and that should be about it. This input is similar, but it's much quicker and easier. We wanted yet another chance for him to grab you, but this time we wanted to make sure that the grab was probably not going to happen. In this case, we have a forward medium punch, which is basically the same as normal medium punch, actually. And you are still doing something akin to a half circle back, but you're doing it much slower. In fact, what you're really doing here is trying to just do down light kick. And then another quarter circle back. And this quickly to get a probably 23, 25, 27 frames of this input in total. But you might not need to worry too much about this if the thing that's making the input long is the start. You only care that the end is quick. Generally though, you want to hide the light kick as shown. You don't want him to actually light kick when it replays. But this means that if he has had some other animation cause him to not do the medium punch, he'll probably do the light kick. And if he does the light kick, even if he goes to the action 2, the slot 2 with the up double punches, he will not actually grab you. It does not set up a tick throw, he just does the light kick and no grab. This is often what you want just because to give him a little bit of extra style of defense or poking at people in neutral while limiting how often he actually tries the grab. But it also increases the number of times he can just grab either in the air, which is less likely, or on wake up, where you want even more of them. This is a similar input. In this case, we want to press one standing medium punch plus medium kick after, in this case, a standing medium punch. I emphasize the medium punch plus medium kick part because you have to hold that until the end, so make sure you set a button that is easy to hold while ending a recording. In this case, this is relatively difficult to do, but it doesn't have to be that precise. You hit the first medium punch and then you give him a short waiting period. Enough frames that if you press medium punch plus medium kick, he does something akin to a target combo instead of actually going into parry. This is one of his special target combo inputs, but you might have to test exactly how you are most comfortable pressing it. Once you've pressed the second medium punch plus medium kick, you kind of have to do one thing very fast and then a bunch of other things that are not normal to do. So expect this input to be fairly hard at first. While holding the medium punch plus medium kick, tap forward once, then tap it again, flick to up forward, and back to forward, and end it that way. This is not absolutely required. You can get away without doing a lot of this part, but he loses a lot of options in jumping, and if you don't get the dash even, then he won't have his standard neutral drive rush. So if you notice those things are missing, you should probably check this input first, as it's possible to get his drive rush from other things, but not this one. Part of the reason why the target combo aspect is so important is because he doesn't actually have a drive rush cancel from that medium punch in the first place, so you won't have any problems with it. His action 5, again, does not actually need to be first frame here. The heavy punch benefits from being first frame, but the reason I bring that up is that you are supposed to hold the heavy punch for the entirety of the input, which means that there's always a chance you'll hit just the heavy punch for a frame or so before the heavy kick gets involved. If it's working correctly, it does not matter. He will still do his drive impact relatively quickly, and your goal at that point is to tap light punch twice while holding the heavy punch. And you're doing this holding down back as well. So forward, heavy punch plus heavy kick, hold the heavy punch the whole time. Quickly move to back and tap light punch twice. Note that there's a gap of 14 frames between those. It doesn't have to be exactly that, it should just be whatever you think will make him do the punches themselves twice. And we'll get back to that one specifically later. Slot 6 is very simple. This is pressing and holding the heavy punch, not for the entire thing, but you are pressing and holding it. Make sure to hold it for a few frames. At the beginning of most inputs in this game, when you are trying to record things, it cuts off maybe sometimes the first and second frame of your input, no matter what you're doing or how you record it. When I originally recorded this, I believe I held that heavy punch for at least 3 frames, but we see here that it only replays as if the neutral heavy punch was only played for 1 frame. Still, that's enough in this case. We'll get our heavy punch, and we basically want him to just charge that punch. During that time, you quickly press up forward, then quickly go to down back. The 2 inputs in the middle don't matter at all. You might care that neither of them are up, but it doesn't matter still. Most of the time it will not ruin your bot. If you find yourself having trouble getting that to work out perfectly, don't worry about it. You're holding down back for quite a while, in this case about 20 frames, and the only purpose of this is to make sure Zangief blocks relatively often. The fact that he ends at the down input for 1 touch is also okay. It can actually be a little longer. You don't actually care too much about the ending here as long as it's not an attack and he's been blocking for a while. The main thing you need to understand about that input is that if you were holding the heavy punch, particularly from slot 5 as shown before, this means he'll jump more. And part of the reason why we don't need to hold the heavy punch right until the end of 6 is so that he jumps and then actually does a heavy punch. This is a complex bot in terms of understanding all the little things that it's built up to do, but that's more so our job until you get here. This slot is almost entirely up to you. You are generally supposed to put in the thing that your character finds most difficult about this matchup. And that can be hard to decide or understand, particularly when I'm basically telling you, okay, make sure this works with everything else he does. One thing that we decided to make sure that he got, though, is just a lot more blocking. And that is, again, somewhat customized to the player that will be using this. But it's also a good general thing for him to have. So this is the one we're going to be putting on the bot page, and this is the one we suggest without any discussion about what character you play. This is the one to input. He just blocks for a long time, about 30 frames, half a second, which is a long time in these games, and then taps down back heavy kicks for his sweep, and very quickly do quarter circle forward. Part of the reason for that quarter circle forward is that in certain situations, it helps him get more options for his super moves. And you want to put it at the end quickly like that so that you can start something else with those quarter circle forward quick things to get your super moves. In this case, for example, it's really tough to do this one because it has to be really fast in a specific way, but you can definitely try it out. This won't have as much effect without that though. Here we are going for up forward to jump, and then relatively quickly doing a quarter circle forward again. You want to do this mostly fast so that if you were to play the first of the two shown just now into the second, you have a chance that he'll do something. But while he's in the air for this, you're trying to hold his heavy kick for a little bit. You can also end the recording with it still held, but this is unlikely this is going to happen if you didn't set it to a specific button type. Doing that forward heavy kick in that space allows him to do other things. So that's going to be even more complicated and require a whole discussion on its own. Therefore, we won't be going into that as much today. Now we are more concerned about his gauge settings. Most of the time, as we have seen it now, the problem that people have with Zangief is more so that when he has super, he has various ways to quickly punish and kill you. He's relatively easy to handle for a lot of characters up until that point, but he's not easy to handle once he has his super available. And it's for this reason that we specifically don't give the bot any specific options for using more supers than would be normal. However, since not every round in the game starts like that, we don't actually have a way to randomize it that I'm aware of, so you might want to change that occasionally. But first we'll show off more of what he's like when he doesn't have any super available. And we're specifically, again, showing off the Cammy situation. He was given a lot of blocking because while Cammy is good at getting in and keeping control of people, she's also relatively susceptible to that. So he can benefit quite a lot from just blocking. If you're a Cammy who wants to constantly get in his face, then instead of the sweep, or even all the blocking, you might just want to go for a really quick throw input with a quarter circle forward, which is another thing that we suggest using. This is for characters like Kimberly and to some extent Lily, who mostly just want to get in really fast. More so for Cammy and Jury, because not only can you play them trying to get in, but they have a lot more benefit from just going for throw. So, putting in a throw that he can use for throw attacking, which he doesn't have naturally, would probably be good. But as you can see here, really what Cammy players care about, if they're the very footsie heavy style, is, hey, I am doing this way. I am now going for pressing to get in, pressing to control, and then if you mess it up and end up too close, the timing should generally be such that he'll grab you. And that is why it was so important that we work out this one the most, because you can vary the amount of time he blocks in that action 7 based on your character's style of play. However long you think he needs to keep blocking to grab you correctly is what you want. Unfortunately, we can't say this is how this works for every character. Tricky characters will probably take the other method, as mentioned before. And power characters have a different flow entirely, which will probably not be either discussed or shown off on this stream. You can also make some effort to change action 8 as noted, but in general, it helps a little bit at levels that people normally use bots, if Zangief does in fact jump quite a lot. If you're still using this bot later on in your Street Fighter 6 life and realize, no, I'm no longer fighting people where I'm no longer fighting at a level where Zangief players are likely to jump a lot. Then you've still got yet another slot you can use to help you pad out whatever it is that will make him most annoying to your character and most capable of doing supers. But let's go into quickly the point system while Arcam continues to show off exactly what's happening here. The point system is not entirely decided yet, simply because of the fact that he does have variations, and we have to work out which of the variations should affect the point system and which of them shouldn't, because this is very matchup dependent. It might end up being one of those things where we tell you just choose your own final point, or maybe even the third point, because what you care about the most is making progress against understanding how to deal with the character, not making up specific points. Unless, of course, you're the sort of person who really only enjoys fighting bots. But even then, probably you care. This bot is defensive enough, particularly in this configuration, where you can start to think about things like hit confirms. But because most hit confirms can be done at a range where Zangief doesn't really tend to do anything about it, we chose to instead focus that into Blanca-bot, who seems to be much better at it as a whole. The result of that was that it's not very clear what Zangief's point system for any given character should be, but we have a good idea of what the main things he is able to do are. So we're mostly going to have you work on dealing with drive rushes, because he is definitely a character that benefits from overloading you mentally and then drive rushing. Dealing with his running bear grab, also known as Siberian Express, which is even harder to see in this game than it was before. And tends to become more available to him when he has less drive engage. And depending on your character and which way your action it went, there's definitely something to be done with that forward heavy kick you saw before, because blocking that overhead is really important for the type of character that also needs to play footsies with him. In fact, he has a lot of moves like that, and you could change it to nearly any of them and keep the same general concept of how to get points against him. So checking his drive rush and still actually getting your own combo out of it is important. Anti-airing him is important enough that we're definitely considering it as one of the main things you could have as a point, at least until you are high enough level at this to decide on an entirely new one to replace it. And then, again, dealing with Siberian Express, getting out of the way, hopefully getting a punish if you can. So, while those are not necessarily ordered, because again, this really depends much more heavily on what your character is, those are the things you should be keeping in mind. He needs to be anti-aired, at least until you've got something clear about what else you need to do. So we'll probably put that as his easiest point. Checking his drive rush and getting a combo from doing that. Avoiding and hopefully punishing the Siberian Express, which again doesn't come up as often when you don't have his refilling bar set a certain way. We'll get back to that in a bit. And dealing with that forward heavy kick, or any similar move where he's basically just spinning his body in some way and you are going to end up getting hit if you hit, for example, a low. If your character doesn't have a lot of play that involves trying to hit Zangief with lows, then you can refocus on things like stopping his drive impact, because it's a good chance that he will use drive impact instead, presumably because whatever it is you're using to stop him from reaching you and not needing to even care about hitting him with blows could be dealt with by his drive impact. One of the things that you might find interesting that makes this somewhat harder is that if he drives and rushes into his heavy punch, he can not only use the heavy punch the full way, he will get armor on it like that, and therefore you don't have as many options as you might think for stopping him from doing it. So you should probably keep it in mind that you can be defeated that way. You can also see here that this bot focuses a lot more on doing the aerial super. And this is partially because while Kami players don't necessarily spend a ton of time jumping, it is important enough to do so in the matchup that he needed anti-air functions. So if your character does also spend a lot of time in the air or looks for ways to deal with that, especially now that Zangief doesn't really have a hitbox behind him on his lariat and you are much safer jumping at him, you will need to care about it. He also will have more aerial spinning power driver also to help with this. So overall, if your character uses a lot of aerial stuff, we're going to classify it as similar to Kami, and you can generally use exactly what you see here until you've gotten enough information from the bot, which will be released probably on Sunday. But that brings us to the end of the Zangief portion of this stream, and now we're moving on to talk about Rashid. We're going to have all three of the players deal with the Rashid part, because we have some specific notes about this character and how much he has changed. If you are familiar with our general Rashid bot advice from before, or Rashid matchup data from before, assume that none of it whatsoever is relevant anymore. But you can consider this to be effectively starting over the stream. We're going to talk about why the bot is built the way it is, some differences related to the CPU, and the general goals you have, then point system, or rather, then inputs, and finally point system, and a little bit of extra notes. So here we go again. This time I'm going to start with the bot once more. But I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the type of character Rashid has become. Rashid before was a character who got into your face and then used a lot of advantages that he had because he was different from the rest of the cast. He got in closer faster, he had ways of keeping going, he could do moves that were not necessarily hard to punish, but if you weren't expecting them, you could end up in strange situations. And he could do all of this very quickly, therefore overloading you, the player, with all of his options. That last part is the part that Rashid has somewhat lost. He's still fairly dangerous in neutral. He still has a lot of moves that can quickly start and get to you. But he can't do as many of them quickly. He doesn't have the variety required to overwhelm most players anymore. At first I was not confident in this assessment, and certainly was not confident in the approach I found to fighting him, but I did go check the top players, I did go check NL versus different characters, and I found that they all, normally it's like they have at least 2 different approaches and I just have to decide which one the bot should have you focus on. No, everyone responded to this character's redesign the same way. What I'm doing right now is technically the entirely incorrect way to fight Rashid. It's the way we used to fight Rashid before. Because we before cared about the fact that he could, from standing at that spot on the screen, he was a threat that you cared about what he did. He's no longer a threat that you care about what he does. Not necessarily because his longer moves are reactable now, but more so because to set up his tricky stuff, he has an entire new move he must do first. And you can not only see him doing this move, he can't very quickly deal with anything you do about it. Fortunately for him, the move itself is not very easy to punish or to stop or anything. Once you've seen him do it, it's his turn. He can do whatever he wants. But you, the player, don't actually care that he's doing that other than your defense. And therefore, the focus was, well, what should my defense be? Your defense is jumping backwards. The reason your defense is jumping backwards is that before, if you jumped backwards against Rashid while he was on his way in toward you, he had moves that would get him into position to punish you for doing that quickly enough. He had good chase options. Those are the main things he's lost, making him a relatively slower and less effective character in specific ways. Another part of our suggestion still matters though. Previously we would always tell you when Rashid is poking you with buttons close range, you should backdash away from him, or neutral jump. And that's what most of the goals of the bot are going to be based around. Right there, I want to backdash because this game limits him even more in that his punches and quick close range moves don't give him enough advantage to keep up with you if you backdash because he lost the chase options. His normals used to be the solution to this before, but now a couple of those have been changed in a way that made them less effective. In the end, it made him sort of a runaway character. He's tricky, yes, but he's not unreactably tricky. He's not straining your cognition anymore. You just have to do that and try not to end up doing it too much. Now, you absolutely can be damaged, particularly if you get pursued by him jumping forward from really close ranges, which is why I mentioned before. Part of what we suggested before still matters. Right there, I didn't want to jump back, I wanted to backdash. And if you're prepared enough and have a specific character type, you can backdash and still anti-air him. So he doesn't get anything out of that either. As a result of this, we found we had to give the bot a lot more backdashes, a lot more ways of getting away from you, and a whole lot more options for specifically avoiding taking damage in neutral from long buttons, because that is a large problem that it produces. He has to do riskier things from far away because it takes too long for him to start up his other options. But as you can see, if your character's backdash is even remotely good, he can't keep up anymore. Even his special command normals, and he has a lot of command normals, don't seem to be doing enough for him at the moment. And because he's still relatively vulnerable to that sort of thing, punching or kicking him in the face, similar to how you fight DJ, basically also works. Tricky characters in this game seem to suffer a lot from that. So, to understand exactly what I'm saying, we'll go more into the point system aspects of it later. But the reason why we don't want to use the CPU for this, if you're familiar with the character, it becomes relatively clear relatively fast. Obviously, the input reading is going to be a problem. But he's technically relatively worse than most characters at it. The main problem is that the CPU generally has problems understanding how to use tricky characters, but for whatever reason, Rashid is worse than usual. He doesn't basically do anything. He dodges around a lot, and if you overcommit to punishing or attacking him when you do this, then yes, it's slightly frustrating, but you can just do a lot of nothing. And because you can do so much nothing, and when he does want to set up a way to stop you, he takes forever to do so, you're usually basically fine. Especially if you've already considered that you should be moving backwards or whatever. So, this is CPU level 6. This is normally where I at least have to care. And it's not because I'm playing Chun-Li either, because she's not necessarily very good at dealing with Rashid in Street Fighter V, for example. You can't hit him with that because of the input reading, but that was partially what made us fade to Discovery. You're not really required to do anything. You can just kind of chill out. But to put that in even greater perspective, I'll have our JP take over. It is definitely not that Rashid is no threat to JP whatsoever. It's more so that he can't really force anything. So we're going to show this off both as CPU and bot, but CPU first. If you're watching from the perspective of understanding this, the thing you care about understanding the most is not necessarily that Rashid can't get in. It's that Rashid does very low damage when he does get in, and the risks he takes while doing so are huge. We thought he was going to be somewhat of a threat during Evo. And then as soon as we realized that this was his new build, and knew that people were feeling positive about JP going into the tournament enough that, you know, a decent number of people would have tried to get through the tournament with him, it became relatively clear that we were not going to see a lot of Rashid. Again, remember this is basically CPU level 7 or 6. It just doesn't have an idea what to do here. It's not that JP needs to do any punishes or work around anything he does, but Rashid just takes too long to do everything. And in a game where you can't get advantage by getting into someone's face and pressing plus buttons, JP kind of isn't even required to do the bare minimum. Against the CPU, our JP player just kind of doesn't care at all. It doesn't help that he does not get through that easily either. You'd think that his tricky aerial options would help out, but as long as JP has enough time to set up one trap, thorn, whatever you prefer to call it, he will almost always escape or manage to hit Rashid before he actually gets any of that set up. So, I'm sure they will make some changes to make this better. I am expecting some changes to Rashid's moves to make them faster, or some additional things like that, making him more capable of using that option with less setup. But if you have even decent air-to-airs as a player, this character is definitely the, okay, I can ult you to death, maybe. So while he's definitely threatening to those who think that this sort of game is hard because of the overwhelming things it can do, force you to deal with, it doesn't come up as much. But now we are going back to bot and making sure that it is not CPU. And in this case, I'm going to give him more SA gauge, because this is kind of important to one specific thing about the character. This is not necessarily something I've worked out whether or not the bot should always have, but I do want to show off what happens if you do it so that you know to care. Rashid has decent normal attacks, but they must be used with some finesse, let's say. And it's relatively difficult to do that when he's facing a character that won't let him anywhere near them. It's part of this reason why he was given this long, relatively pointless parry animation. We gave him the long parry simply because of one of the things you want to do against him in neutral, and that be to stop him from setting up certain things. The parry is not here because we expect Rashid players to be parrying in neutral for long periods a lot. The parry is here as a way of indicating to you, the player, hey, you're too predictable with your long buttons. Your long button is meant to check his setups. If you find yourself hitting the parry too often, you've made an error somewhere. Your approach might be too overzealously focused on that aspect of it, and therefore, it wouldn't be realistic. Whether or not we go far enough to make you count the points for the number of times you actually hit that parry with your long buttons is still under discussion. But overall, you don't really have any specific thing you need to do here relative to the parry at all. It's just there. And we'll be looking into whether or not it is reasonable to remove it as a whole, or expand it in some way that helps against specific characters. Generally, this bot can be used with a lot of SA gauge available, because I've set up the situation so that he tends to do the super only at very, very specific times. And in general, you wouldn't really want him to lose out on the opportunity to do that because he happened to not have it. Simply, he's also a character who is, because he's going to try to set you up and cash out on that setup fairly early, you'll care a lot more about how much super meter he has. But you won't necessarily benefit a lot from waiting until he has enough to care. The rarity of his super is somewhat similar to the one from our Kami bot, which means you might not even see it at all today. But I figured I should at least turn it on and do the general bot demo with this up, so that we could be a little bit clearer on it. One of the other reasons why you might find that the parry actually matters to Rashid if he's not just doing nothing in neutral, is that it actually maintains his drive gauge pretty well, which is something that Rashid players do have a reason to do. Being very tricky means that your opponent is more likely to take the chances when they can get them. And that means you're likely, as the Rashid player, to know when that's going to happen. You can manipulate other person's mindset to do specific things, and then just wait for them to do them. So, there's a nice demo of why you actually care about him having this long parry that doesn't actually have a proper purpose. The more parry he has, the harder you will find it to be to lock down the bot by just taking every opportunity you have available to you. This bot also has a couple minor variations in its point system, which we were about to go into, but not so many variations in its inputs. You have options for how to do it based on how you think the character is supposed to work yourself, or how you have a personal experience, but the overall outcome of it isn't going to be like Zangief, where you actually have to care about how it fits in with the rest of it. It's just going to be the usual basic, hey, you can change this to whatever you think is important, and it probably won't make anything happen one way or the other. Therefore, let's quickly go into that next. Rocher's inputs are a bit quicker and easier to understand than Zangief's because we don't have to discuss anything about how to do the edge shifting. And a lot of them ended up being really simple by design. This one is just a down back heavy punch, followed by a jump and back dash. This was simply to get everything we could into one input to get started without having to worry about anything else. His crouch heavy punch is quite good, and it will usually result in him not jumping if you play it just by itself like this. That's it. His second input is similar. We want a crouching medium punch, which is also quite good normal for him. Not particularly long range, but it does tap you very well. And then a forward dash where the second forward also transitions into down forward down to make it possible to do any moves of that type. That's also quite short, there's nothing specific there. You can do this as a crouch medium kick as well, depending on your character, but somewhat personalized for things. You're going to have to work that out for yourself because one of them matters a lot for characters like Cammy, who often are playing footsies and trying to get into the air and move around, and one matters more for very grounded characters. The one we're probably likely to put on the site, given that more characters are likely to be playing grounded, is the crouch medium kick. But we will probably mention all of the things we're mentioning now. His action 3 requires you to hold just the light punch for this until the end. But you are starting with down forward, light punch plus medium punch. You can hold the medium punch for a while, it doesn't matter. But only the light punch needs to be held until the end. So, down forward, another forward dash, and then a quarter circle back. And end the recording quickly. Action 4 is similarly simple. This is a back throw, and the back throw is where you hide his drive impact. And since it is a drive impact, we have time to put in that drive impact another jump. But if you're really fast, which is the hope here, and given the length of animation of the throw, he will not actually jump either. If you realize that he is jumping, it's probably not that bad, but you can work on getting it quick because it doesn't actually require that much effort. It's not a terribly straining input. The throw doesn't have to be first frame either, so just back throw, neutral, drive impact, tap up, and then quarter circle forward. It's a difficult sequence to get used to, but if you can get it fast enough after a bit, you shouldn't need to worry about anything else. Action 5 is just giving him his glorious stand heavy kick. And we're putting another throw tech in here for good measure. In this case, I've put it in as back throw. This might not be the final because it doesn't actually need to be a back throw, and there's no point in complicating anything that you don't need to complicate. Another quarter circle forward is useful. But part of the reason it ended up like this is because we figured let's have him block for a little bit in there because this animation of the heavy kick is relatively long. So it helps if he's blocking for the whole time. And that means that if you happen to do this as a back throw because you are pressing the down back quite early, then it's fine. His action 6 is forward light punch, forward medium punch. I believe that most of the time he does both of the moves. And this is the rhythm you're usually aiming for, where he does in fact complete the light punch, then do the medium punch. But as you can see from the inputs, this seems to be more so related to a target combo. We're not absolutely sure, and I didn't think to look into it enough. It just worked, so here we are. You're holding the medium punch until the end, and again, you can sneak in some down back if you need it, and yet another backdash. If you can't get in much of the down back, don't worry about it. You're going to back anyway, and this input doesn't have a lot in it. All of these are actually part of setting up his various actual tricky moves, and therefore the timing for them might be different for different players. But in general, we don't seem to have any real problems getting him to do everything required. The game is relatively lenient on how quickly you can input them. This is the action that gives him his command dodge. That one frame of forward light kick here is pretty relevant. That just happened because of blinking. So we're pressing forward light kick plus medium kick. You're holding the light kick the entire way. And that makes it slightly difficult to get your head around because you are also then doing a drive rush cancel input. The shortcut version, where you are pressing forward, then forward medium punch plus medium kick really quickly. You can hold this to the end as well, but it generally doesn't do anything because he doesn't have a lot of other inputs that start with the medium kick. And the one that does, it's either side, so it doesn't matter if you hold it or not. This one is also ended with the 6-3-2. He does a lot of dashing, relatively speaking, in this input. And you can use either drive rush cancel input here, but we still suggest using the main tapping one. In the end, it doesn't really tend to matter too much because he spends all of his time in this input just doing that. This doesn't actually come up in the bot playing back very often, so don't be too surprised if you don't see it just because he's been doing that. And now, action 8, which is very long. This is the aforementioned long parry. This long parry starts with a crouching medium punch, and then whatever you figure will be best for your character. In most cases here, we suggest using what will give him Eagle Spike. But because you're holding the medium punch, when you press the next thing, the medium kick, it looks as if we're pressing medium punch plus medium kick on purpose, but that is just because the medium punch is being held the whole time. So this can be a lot less complex to explain if you think of it as just crouch medium punch, quarter circle, kick. You're holding this kick too, and then just press happy punch twice. So what you're seeing on the screen is not a very clear indicator of how complex this actually is. It doesn't matter if the heavy punches are hidden or slow or anything. If you find that you don't need him to do a lot of Eagle Spike because he already has enough quarter circle forwards in here that he probably should manage it on his own, you'll switch it as you see on screen here. So Eagle Spike is actually a quarter circle forward move, but this one I have swapped it to is quarter circle back because of various other reasons. This mostly has to do with the fact that he has too many command normals though, so you don't really care about which things he does or doesn't do at any given time. Just get the inputs more or less correct, and you will probably get a bot that works. If there's any confusion, you can double check it later. This input ends up being quite long at the end, which is something that you're not necessarily going to see a lot. But let's go into point system, and I'll hand it back to Arkami to continue showing off the generality of this, given that that character is probably the best one for going through this in the first place. Generally, the thing we care about for Rashid is that he gets into your face and then the player decides what the mix-up is. Something like that. He just gets close enough, and if you haven't reacted to that, if you've let him get close, then he usually actually has a mix-up, a real mix-up that you can't just react to or avoid. That is what all those little extra bits are for, building up those mix-up spaces. And therefore the point system is based on avoiding those scenarios as much as possible. For most characters, hitting him with a long button isn't actually part of the point system as noted. Him doing that there, that's just part of the matchup and it doesn't apply to every character in the first place. So it's kind of important to not spend too much time like that. And he's actually relatively harder to anti-air because he can make tricky things happen when he jumps. It's not impossible, but you should assume that if he's jumped, a player is thinking about what they can do to make your anti-air whiff. Which puts him in the camp of Street Fighter V's Kage, where when he jumps at you, particularly if he was in like that spacing you just saw, your goal is to forward dash under him. Because most of the time, given his movements, hitboxes, etc., you're not going to get to do much else. So, a good way to think about this in sequence is that if you are at footsie range, as Cammy often wants to be, and you are thinking, okay, I probably shouldn't hit a button, he's going to do something quick and get out of the way of my button. Be ready to forward dash. If you're not in footsie range, you don't have to think about this at all. You just continue to relax and do pretty much nothing. But if you wanted to get in close enough to poke at him, play footsies and so on, assume that if he does jump, you are looking to forward dash. Otherwise, you can play footsies as normal and hope that the Rashid player doesn't overwhelm you with their skills. But the stressful part of this matchup and the bot is that once he is there, once he is close enough to you, presumably because, you know, you thought to not hit a button, he'll start to do things himself, and you have to decide which of your two escapes is the correct one. The majority of the time, your correct escape is to back jump. You only get a point if you quote-unquote were right in that he tried to follow you and failed. Because this game's characters tend to, let's say, fight from closer, the screen zooms in, they have longer normals, and so on, if you manage the back jump, if you hit your longest air normal, there's a decent chance Rashid is going to get hit in the head, and usually he gets hit before he can even recover to block. We judge this based on the fact that most of the time he gets hit in the head, even though I specifically put in all that down back to see if he could probably crouch and therefore get missed. But it doesn't tend to work out that way. When he is hitting actual normal attacks like there, if you don't think you have enough of a positive situation after that attack, you backdash. The back jump is only required after specials or things that look like they're supposed to be setups. Normally, when Rashid does a special move and has forced you to block it, he needs to hit regular buttons again. He takes too long to start up his other specials. And even with his invincible options on Spinning Mixer, you can get away with a lot just by back jumping. And at worst, you'll cause him to waste a lot of energy to stop him. This is partially the reason why we gave the bot so much backdashing. It's just to frustrate you. It's just to make you think constantly about the fact that this character is moving away from the range you want to fight him at, which is, again, why it doesn't really work that well on JP. He's moving away from the range that you get most of your damage from, and then whenever he does come back, you have to constantly switch quickly to defending in ways that are not normal for most cast characters. Back jumping and back dashing are not the first way one thinks to defend in this game. You have other options for that. Similarly, the mid-range is spent doing nothing, mostly. And therefore he's basically taken the spot of Zeku from our Street Fighter V bots. If you've ever felt yourself needing that sort of training, if you're familiar with our Zeku bot, he basically does similar things now. He's going to be constantly moving back and forth, making you change the mental state you're in order to get anything done. And messing with all your automatic reactions. It's also a good way to test how strong your character's back dash is or their back jump normals. But you saw a good demonstration just now. After the Arabian Cyclone special, you back jumping and hitting a button is great. If he's just punched you with his light punch or medium punch, or even like done a really good job on the heavy punch spacing, you generally just want to back dash because he can actually chase you relatively well from there. Whereas with the specials, even though you can't punish him all of the time, he also can't start his next move fast enough. And he has a lot of good reasons to do things. That is another skill you can build up, as just demonstrated, to expect that he will do something. But a lot of the time he's trying to set you up to do this anyway, because in order for that to work well, you probably had to hit a button after he did his medium or jab or whatever it was once he got closer. And he might be setting you up to do that. So don't necessarily count on your drive impact either. It is definitely an option you can afford to use when you think you have a read, but it probably shouldn't be the default for most characters. In general, he's trying to get you to try to punish him in spaces where you can't succeed at doing that, and then make your life miserable. So we decided to focus the bot around getting people a lot of experience with understanding how to do that, how to just do nothing for short periods. So, to go over briefly again, your point system is that when he jumps at you, you can anti-air him, or you will also get a point if you just forward dash under him. If you want it to be even slightly difficult, you can see if your character has a punish that you can get after your forward dash, but this isn't consistent across the cast, so consider it important if you think it will matter to you. It's still going to be the point A, the easiest point in which you stop counting after a bit, so don't worry about it too much. The next thing you're caring about is that when he's in your face like that, when he throws out that one single light punch or uses the medium punch hop to get closer, backdash away from that. You can get hurt for doing this in a real match, but it puts so much more mental strain on your opponent to get even decent damage against you that you might as well do it most of the time. Because if you don't do it, he's almost certainly going to get something that you really don't want to happen, setup-wise. When you block basically any of his special moves from close, then back jump. You don't necessarily need to take a hit to him with your heavy kick or whatever other long or normal you use from the air to take the point. Just back jumping alone in this case should be counted as enough. The more time you spend in the air, the better this generally works because he's that sort of character. Most of the time you will get off the ground quickly enough that even if he does have a follow-up normal, he won't get any combos because he'll be hitting the airborne and his juggle points seem to be bad. This may change later on and we'll update the bot data page and possibly the point system if it turns out that they improve his juggles to the point where it matters, or if we notice that a lot of top level players have juggles that we haven't seen before. But in my hours of review, I did not see any such juggles existing, and therefore, for now, this should probably be enough. The last thing that is super important is actually your drive reversal, which is not a thing that we've had much reason to tell people to train or use in this game at all. But there are situations that Rashid can put you in, particularly players. The bot has a little bit more trouble doing those situations consistently. But there's a good one. You're cornered, he's doing heavy kick and medium kick stuff. You don't know if he's going to super because he has enough. You need to get him off you. And because his move style tends to be committed enough, and drive reversal is just so relatively powerful, you hit it simply to get him away. We're still considering in exactly what condition you should get the point for this, because it's fairly easy to just block and drive reversal a lot of things he does. Meaning that we probably need it to be a specific thing he does to put more strain on you mentally. You had to recognize that a specific thing was happening and choose to drive reversal that one. But it can also be just that this character is so frustrating that you don't actually have a requirement to do that. And of course, we have to check on that as well, because the way he does the attacks, it might just be that you just have to not get parried or not get blocked. Because he can, in fact, do both of those things, often after hitting the sort of normals in close range where you would get to do the drive reversal. So we're going to work on that one some more, but for the purposes of using this from this stream, just treat it as anything. If you drive reversal anything he does, it's probably fine. There are ways to make him do whatever super you consider most important for your character by modifying the 7th input. Mainly because he has things that end in quarter circle back and things that end in quarter circle forward, changing his action 7 to be something that starts with that will remove his command dodge, but it's the only thing we could think of that was worth actually dealing with. Fortunately, it will put it in the same space rhythm-wise, which is useful enough here, because if you have a character where you're constantly worried about Rashid doing super, that's probably also the spacing and timing where he would have thought that a command dodge was a good idea. And therefore we'll use it that way. You can be confident that if you put either a quarter circle back, if you need a specific super from that, or quarter circle forward, and whatever button is required to activate the super, and then, just for the sake of it, probably still put back in the same command dash hidden in that input, that you should still get something you want. But of course, all of that will be detailed on our website, 2-mk.org, on Sunday around this same time when the bots are released. Next week we'll be going into Blanca bot stuff, and possibly finally have worked out enough for additional characters. But we also know that Aki will be releasing fairly soon. We don't know exactly when, I don't think. So checking into that could probably be important. It's possible that you will get Aki along with Blanca, particularly if she's relatively easy to understand or build up things around. Since we've now covered most of the cast, and we're reasonably sure it's not time yet to do Manon, you might get Blancabot by himself. And so now we clear out the last bit of Rashid. You can find all of our bots on our website, as mentioned, 2-mk.org, with various navigation options for which game you want, as we have many outside of Street Fighter. And we'll probably be working on more soon as more games are released. The only thing we're generally missing is either a game where we don't get the option to use bots reasonably at all, like Guilty Gear, or games like Tekken, where it doesn't come up as much and you more so need to practice your combos and movement than learning to deal with specific tools that your opponent is using to pressure you or otherwise make your life difficult. We'll be letting you know whether or not we have actually released a bot. As always on Twitter, at 2_MK_FGC, which is also where you can get all the information on what we're streaming and when we're streaming, usually again around the same stream time, as well as any information about why we are not, or things that need clarifying relative to bots or similar. You can use that account to contact us, at least as long as Twitter continues to allow that function. But of course, if it doesn't continue to allow it, you can count on being able to do things through our website. If you have questions or need to share information to us about something you've noticed in bots, we always appreciate anyone letting us know either strange behaviors, difficulties they've had with inputting things, or so on, at the email provided there. But it looks like we've come to the end of tonight's stream, and I have missed the pool super that I was going to use to show that off. This has been Brilliant 14 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night everyone.